Good afternoon. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Conversations with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, May 12th, 2022. And on Thursday, I talk with friends of mine, colleagues, friends, partners. I call us companions. And I use that term companions after the book I read by Ikwe Arma, The Way of Companions. And it rings with me that people discover each other on a path, and they support, enjoy, encourage, and enable each other to pursue common visions, common aims. And I feel that's what we do here. And others may be joining us today, but right now it's my colleague, Brenda Lyle Gray, and my colleague and friend, Ndugu Yusef Mgeni. We were talking just before we began, Brenda, about college, HBCUs. I said that this morning I was on a panel from Black Press USA, their morning program. The topic was the value of HBCUs. And one of the participants was a lawyer, Vicky Wright Smith. I think she did her law degree, her graduate work at Howard, and had gone to maybe another college for undergrad work, but also a young man named Sam Collins, who now writes for the major Black newspaper in DC, the Washington Informer. And there were the standard and kind of expected accolades, remembrances, reminiscing around all the joy and all of the positivity and all of the benefits of coming out of and being a part of the Black college or university experience. But there was also a question about, you know, does it really prepare you to do battle in the real world? And is there an argument that makes sense about going to a predominantly white school, or they're calling it PWUs? Is that the phrase they're using now? Predominantly white institutions, PWIs, yeah. And does that prepare you? So, there were no conclusions, but the questions being raised, and it's a question we have to ask ourselves. I made reference to the fact that I've been studying and listening to Professor Greg Carr, who is the head of the Africana Studies Department at Howard University, and he and Karen Hunter, creating this project, who I'm advertising now, called Narrative, are talking all the time about the jailbreak, breaking out of the structure of organized higher education. They're saying the pandemic proved that higher education as we know it cannot sustain itself, will not last. Things will change. The technology means more knowledge is more available to more people than ever before, and that knowledge is no longer confined to the walls of academia. It's accessible and it's transmittable, and people can consume it, build on it, and shape it to use and validate and to grow their own reality. And so that's a discussion I think we're going to have in the future. But let me start with that, Brenda, because I said that, I started off at Morehouse College in Atlanta, and it was a good experience for me being there because it was affirming, and you were around people who both respected and expected productivity, and ultimately great things from you. And it was and I ended up coming back to the University of Minnesota, different environment. But what I learned and picked up at Morehouse fortified me at the University of Minnesota and beyond. So Brenda, what are your thoughts and feelings?
Well, I had mentioned to you before we went live, both of my daughters went to predominantly white schools. Milana came out of USC with a full scholarship, and Gianni had a full scholarship at University of Redlands. But Gianni suffered a great deal behind the racism at University of Redlands because she was the first Black on the tennis team. And both of my daughters were athletes. Milana was ranked fifth in the nation in the 200 in 1990. She was going to go to the Olympics, but she knew about the drugging and the doping, and she said that she just could not compete with young ladies who were on the steroid. So she chose to go to graduate school and become an actress and a writer. I think it's a draw. There was a lot of struggle as far as um, financing for the HBCs, and I was a single mother, a teacher, and there was no way that I was going to be able to afford to send them to college on my own. So, did I take the athletic route, to which I did? Took all of Milana's clippings, put them in an envelope, and sent them to 19 colleges and said, go see my daughter run at the AAU. I didn't know any other way. Gianni kind of earned her way up in the tennis ranks because she started playing at 4. So I was preparing on that end. But what Gianni went through with my fighting the Klan and bringing up CORE on the campus and all of that trauma, she's never shed that at all. So I think, and especially for Black girls, they're just caught in between because when they went to Black schools, there were problems with their own because they were athletes. So it was like a mixed bag of tricks there. But they both got degrees, 2 degrees. And, I'm very proud of that. If it were not for my parents, it would not have happened. But as far as taking care of while I was trying to teach the most difficult subject matter in International Baccalaureate. So, but I wish they would have had that experience. I think their lives might have been different. It might have been a different direction. And I'm just so envy Jonathan Palmer when he was talking about how they get together on the weekends and they call them, what is it, Spell House?
Spell House, right?
And they're connected and people can jump in. I just think that camaraderie would have been so great for them. And that is one part of it that I regret. But the education came first. And however I could do it, I had to figure it out.
Let me introduce you both to Vicki Wright Smith, who's an educator and a lawyer, and she's rocking Howard University. And
that's so great.
Vicki, what I just told my colleague Yusef and Brenda about this morning's show that you were on, and I was giving them the quick summary of the flow of the conversation, and I told them that I had invited you, and I'm so glad that you were able to join. And we started off even before we went on camera talking about Brenda's children's challenges, and what you described, I think, was different about your experience at a Black college. I think I said you did your law work at Howard, right? With
yes,
undergrad
that's correct.
and a white. So talk to us, sort of tell us what you said this morning. But we're having an open architecture conversation about Black schools versus white schools, or what combinations work for us and work against us.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes.
Okay, because I can't hear myself. So, yeah. And then when I got off this morning, I thought about my daughter's situation, which was kind of the reverse. So I grew up in what I thought was a pretty diverse area in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, even though it's Amish, but it's Black, it's a city there. And so I could do anything I wanted in high school, homecoming queen, class president, the whole nine. But none of that prepared me for when I went to Penn State. And those white folks would call you the N-word at the drop of a hat.
In a quick second.
And, yep. And by the time I left there, I really felt like I was around folks that had never seen Black people before. So at that point, I was like, I got to get to HBCU because I have to experience it and see what the difference is. And it was a huge difference, obviously. And then being in Chocolate City, I shared earlier that my brother he did go to Howard, and he knew the challenges that I was facing, and he invited me down for a Howard homecoming, which you all know that's epic right there. And I was like, oh, wow, this is great. And so when I started applying to law schools, Howard was at the top of my list. And the tour, they took us right back to the yard, and we hung out on the yard. And I was like, all right, this is it for me. And so I was thrilled when I got accepted there. But the one funny story that I do have, though, when I was at Penn State, one of the reasons I was there is because they were trying to recruit minority students, and they were trying to hit this 5% mark. I don't think they hit it to this day. But they promised us that they would pay for our tuition the entire time we were there. My parents would only be on the hook for the room and board, and they did. And so when I got to Howard, I was like, excuse me, when I was at Penn State, they paid for my tuition the entire time I was there. I haven't had that discussion with anyone here. And it was Dean Newsom. He said, well, we never promised you that, Miss Wright, but here's this loan application, and I can promise you, you fill this out, you'll get it. And you work really hard while you're here, you'll qualify for a scholarship, and then that will help you out. And I did ultimately get a scholarship my last year there, but it's, it's been great. And then as far as my daughter growing up in DC, she attended McKinley Tech High School, which you could probably count on one hand the number of white kids that were there. So she wanted to go the other way, and she really did want to experience attending a PWI, and she ended up at West Virginia University. But I grilled their butts when we were going there. I was like, how's it going to be for her? Because I remember what it was like for myself. I hear the stories for the kids at Penn State now, and I don't want her to have that experience. And fortunately, she did not. So I'm thankful for that.
Good news. Yusef, jump in, brother. What's your take or thoughts on
this
topic?
I did it backwards, Al, because I went to an African-American Catholic elementary school, grades 1 through 8, and the teachers were the Oblate Sisters of Providence, whose mother house is in Baltimore, who were all Black. And so we got Carter G. Woodson and John Hope Franklin and the miseducation of the Negro, like in 4th grade. All right.
Whoa.
I tell people with no shame that I owe everything I am to them Black nuns and my mother and my grandmother. Okay, because they coerced us. They threatened to send us to Jesus if we didn't become a credit to the rich. So by the time I got in high school, I was bored. Okay, because they were doing in high school what we were doing in the 5th grade, And so I attended, I audited some classes at UCLA because my sister broke her tailbone, and I moved to Los Angeles and spent about 5 years out there. Became a surrogate father for my 5-year-old nephew, and helped my sister get back on her feet, paying rent, groceries. And, LA in the 60s, it was us, it was the Panthers, it was Hair, it was the African twist, and I was enjoying life, okay? But we begged our son to go to an HBCU, and he wound up going in the Navy and running a $5 million intelligence computer and controlling 27 satellites that were connected with all of the ships and all of the bases all over the planet. And ironically, his power came from the fact that he decided which movies were shown on the satellite in which parts of the world at which time. So he would get a call from an admiral saying, son, can you play Hunt for Red October tomorrow night around dinner? And my son would say, we can work on it. What part of the world are you in? You're in the Black Sea? Okay. How about 7 p.m. your time? And the person he worked for broke his hip and left. So he was 18 years old, had 32 full-grown men reporting to him who were coders and control the satellite transponders. And he's obviously a nerd and a geek, but has become very successful at it. Our daughter went to FAMU, Florida A&M. And I have a T-shirt that says, I'm a FAMU dad, and it's the most expensive T-shirt I ever bought. Okay. She graduated in psychology from FAMU, and the beauty was that there were about 8 or 10 young people from the Twin Cities who graduated at the same time, who all went to FAMU. And they created a posse and would meet every day and do their studies together and their research and really support one another academically, which helped all of them grow and develop academically even faster. With a degree in psychology, she next moved to Seton Hall in New Jersey and got 2 degrees, and then began her work on a PhD at Lehigh University, was one of only 2 Black students in the psychology program, graduate school. And it was clearly a PWI because one of the faculty members attacked the other Black female in the psych program because she wanted to practice Christian psychology. And he told her that Christians were not fully developed people. And so my daughter jumped to the defense of this other sister and took the professor on.
I'm sorry.
Was laughing at him. So I said, this won't work. So we got her into Drexel University in Philadelphia, which was a much more inclusive environment because of the urban setting.
Right.
And I attended UCLA, the University of Minnesota, Metropolitan State University, went back to the university and took graduate classes. And my problem was that I was reluctant to give credit to anybody else for my education because most of it was either self-taught or at the knee of Black women who told me, you're going to be a credit to the race or we're going to whoop your butt. And so being 6'6", when I was a kid, I always got drafted. Let Yusef do it. Let Charles do it. And I got pushed out front of the kids and then the adults, and spent my entire life working for nonprofits, doing work in constituency governed organizations in the community. So I think I got what I needed from where I came from. And I was not only able to take it with me, my manhood, my Blackness, and my dignity, but to bring it back after I concluded my education and apply it right where I began. And I think that I've enjoyed a lot of leadership opportunities because of that. And there were people that used to come up and shake my hand who I didn't know and press a $20 bill in my hand and say, here, use this to help with tuition. Because I was not eligible and did not apply for scholarships and had to work and pay my own way. But I definitely support HBCUs and the legacy of going to Dunbarton, Howard University Law School. With all of that history, I mean, hey, I've been to the Dunbarton campus and attended seminars at the Howard Law School, and just the environment just fired me, because I thought, this is where Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall and what was Paulie's last name?
Murray.
Paulie Murray hung out. Hey, and I'm just through osmosis, I'm feeling all this energy and all this history and this legacy. And sister, I'm so proud of you for coming through Howard Law School because, they put Black lawyers on the map. Okay. And we owe much of the most significant legal battles that we have not only survived and developed, but won to that cadre of people who came out of Howard Law School and brought that courage and that information and that knowledge back to our community. So, it's a continuum, and we used to say each one reach one, each one teach one. So we have to reach behind and bring somebody along with us and make sure that they have a mentor, a buddy, somebody who's going to hold them accountable, and a full appreciation. Because when you look at the graduate schools in the HBCUs, most of the students are white because of the tuition being more manageable, because of the access being greater, and because the demand not being as overbearing as it is in many of the PWIs. And so we've got more young Black women than brothers attending HBCUs. And we really need to encourage young Black people in the community to do that, because so many of them want to go to Wall Street or Fortune 500 companies and believe, pardon me, that the only way they can do it is to shadow those other folks who are going to be in leadership and management positions in those organizations. So mine was, I don't want to call it an alternative path, but a dissimilar one that produced what I'd like to think are similar results. So if you look at the rings on an Olympic flag, the circles are concentric, but they don't overlap 100%. So I'm one of those circles that was out on the edge, but still got the concentric benefits of what was happening in HBCUs.
Victor, you talked about Pauline Murray this morning, I believe, didn't you?
Oh,
Yes.
my goodness.
Yes.
What a job.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
What a
review
job.
that again.
Yeah, well, most of us know the history of Paulie Murray, going to Howard, all the work she did there, being one of the smartest in the class and having to compete against the Black men there.
She was valedictorian.
Yeah.
Hey, can I say two things?
Yes, please.
Paulie Murray wrote a paper in law school about not supporting what was the railroad case that they overturned in '54 that said as long as blacks are as long as they're equal, it's okay to be separate.
Well, separate was equal.
Plessy
versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson. Yep.
She wrote a paper in law school that Thurgood Marshall and the others used in their argument before the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education.
Yep.
She wrote another paper about the 13th Amendment, and most of the cases.
Remember that.
Most of the cases in the 13th Amendment have been filed by corporations, saying if slaves are people, we want to be people too. We want these benefits. And Paulie Murray wrote a paper indicating that, Sojourner Truth said, ain't I a woman too? We're equal under the 13th Amendment. And when Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued before the Supreme Court, whose paper did she use? Paulie Murray.
Yep.
Okay. And won that case as well. So Paulie Murray, and at 60 years old, resigned from one of the major law firms as a partner, I think it was in New York, and went to seminary school and became an Episcopal minister and a bishop. And I mean, she just made so many contributions. You can't name them all. Unnamed, unaccoladed, unrecognized, and was a giant in the civil rights movement. And they released a documentary last year called My Name is Paulie.
Yep.
And if you haven't seen it, it is incredible.
It's
absolutely incredible. My name, Pauli, Paulie. My name is Paulie Murray. And she was tough, okay? She applied to go to either Harvard or Yale, wound up at Princeton. And then one of the Ivy League colleges offered her a faculty position. And she said, if I wasn't good enough to get in your law school, I'm not interested in teaching your law students. Yeah. Okay. And I think she taught, didn't she come back to Howard and teach?
I believe she did. I believe she did.
Woo!
Yeah. When Yusef made that comment about Pauline not being able to go back to law school, it reminds me of this comment that was on CNN, and I forgot who did it at 3:00 this morning. He said, if my child is good enough to experience racism, then she's good enough to learn about it. Yeah. And I went, whoa, where is Ted Cruz?
Yeah. she was one of the first female law students at Howard University.
Yeah.
Was she not?
Yep. Yeah. Yes.
And was turned down from the Ivy League colleges. Yeah. They wouldn't tell her because she was black. They told her because she was a woman. But was valedictorian everywhere she went. Was tough. Okay. And,
that is so great.
Oh, and that movie is on Amazon Prime. And he's
Amazon
right.
Prime.
If you have not watched it, please take the
And
time
what is
to
it?
watch it.
What is it called again? Paulie, P-A-U-L-I.
My name is Paulie.
My name is Paulie. Yeah, my name is Paulie. And it's really good. I mean, I learned so much about her too.
I think I remember the 13th Amendment paper. And it was really tough because she talked about Harvard and the presidents being slave owners, going all the way back, and how they profited from being slave owners,
And Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave her credit for writing that paper, laying out that precedent, doing that research.
Mm-hmm.
As a law student, okay?
Yeah, as a law student.
Unbelievable.
Right.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
And Vicki, I'm going to talk about this one. He reads 18 to 20 newspapers a day. So, I live in the mountains of Santa Fe. Al and I went to kindergarten together. So, we hooked up, thank God. He gave me an opportunity to write, and, it's just been great. But I don't live in Minneapolis. So I have a 40-year-old mentor, and I have a mentor that is an evolving senior, and they help me when I don't understand some of what's going on in Minneapolis, but I'm learning. Al says I took a crash course. I really did. Believe me, especially after George Floyd. But I feel like I have gone back to graduate school because I've learned so much from both Sean Lewis and Yusef. And it was so funny because, Vicki, I'd mess up his name all the time. And then he gets another name that I can't pronounce. And I said, I'm done. He's my mentor.
It means brother. And just like it reads.
I learned so much from him. And
Al and I started the Twin City Black Journalists 52 years ago. Okay?
Wow.
So he and I are somewhat acquainted.
History.
It's been beautiful. And we have two other Kansas City, it's Al's cousin, Professor Dean, Dr. Burnele Powell, and we all grew up on 28th Street in Kansas City. So it's just been great with the 70 years of friendship. But this one
I mentioned to Brent,
like an encyclopedia. Yeah. And then the other
one, he went roll with Paulie.
Tell me about it.
He did more justice than I could have done her.
Kamau King was he is a retired attorney, and he was with Coca Cola, and he was in Africa, where this guru just came from, Dr. McFarlane. But it's really, really been great. And what a wonderful experience you must have had at Howard. It had to be unbelievable.
It was. And just like you said, just you're there and you're hearing the history and the legacy and all the people that came through there and all the great things that they've done in the community. And even while I was there, after that, we would learn about Sharon Pratt Dixon, the first Black female mayor of DC, and then Governor Wilder when he went on to become governor. And it just, like I was saying earlier, when you go to Howard, you just leave there filled up with so much pride of the history of all the people that have come before you, and you just want to go out and you want to do good and you want to represent that university in a positive way. And I always do that every time I do anything.
That's great. I wish my daughters would have had that experience, but everything happens for a reason and a season.
Yes,
that's for sure. Dr. McFarlane,
Dr. Irma
on the other side.
Dr. Irma was a college president at Shaw University in North Carolina, and is an anthropologist, an author, a poet, photographer,
archivist,
a lot of things. And she does education and culture editing for Insight News. So she's just a jewel and a treasure. And 2 weeks ago, she was doing the program from South Africa.
Thank you.
We were talking about this whole question Vicki Wright and I were on a panel this morning at NNPA, the daily talk show they have, a news show, talking about the value, the proposition of Black or HBCUs and the differences that people have attending either a white or a Black college, and talking about the value of the experience and what it does for us. I raised, and I couldn't get on the whole program because my mic wasn't working for some reason, but it was on for the last maybe minute. And the question I raised in that minute was in reference to Greg Carr, Dr. Greg Carr from Africana Studies at Howard University, who, along with Karen Hunter, has created this project called Narrative. And Narrative is an online community for learning and also building. And one of the propositions is that the pandemic is something that's created what he calls a jailbreak, that teachers and students and families have been able to and are going to break free from the structure and stricture of organized academia, that there are more ways to learn and more ways to have access to more information for more people around the planet. And he said, Greg is saying, if I'm hearing him properly, that this is the beginning of a sea change in how people look at and engage the learning processes for their entire lives. And maybe the accreditation that comes with the university system as it is now may not have the same meaning or value. Maybe it will. So what are your thoughts, Irma? What are your feelings? And then Vicki, jump in. Please meet Irma. Irma, meet Vicki.
Hi.
Vicki's a lawyer in DC. And are you a teacher as well, Vicki?
I am not. I wanted to clear that up. I do presentations to individuals on wills and powers of attorneys. I'd love to be somebody's professor somewhere, but that hasn't happened for me yet.
Okay.
I bet you'd be dynamite in the classroom.
I wish they give me a chance.
I want to speak from sort of a dual perspective, is that I attended up through high school. I attended what were basically segregated institutions, all Black students, white administrators, some Black and white teachers. And then for college, I was part of that wave. I guess I call myself a sort of beneficiary of the civil rights movement. So I was part of that wave of Black students who were among the first to start integrating in large numbers white institutions. So in 1969, I attended Grinnell College on a full scholarship. And my class was the largest class of Black students they had enrolled up to that point. There were 18 of us.
It's in Iowa, right?
Out of 1,220 students.
Is that in Iowa, Irma? Grinnell, is that in Iowa?
Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa, considered the Harvard of the Midwest. It is a place that has a tremendous amount of resources. In all of its history, it's never gone into the red. It has some famous people who've attended it so that they have a lot of money coming in. So the founder of the Des Moines Register was chair of the board, Joe Rosenfeld, for a number of years. And his very good friend was that guy named, what's his name, who makes all the money? It just dropped out of my head.
Elon?
Who is it? It's
Elon Musk,
money guy who makes all
Buffett?
Yes, Warren Buffett was his good
okay.
friend. And so Warren Buffett was advising him on how Grinnell should run its endowment. Also, one of our alumni was Noyce, who invented the Intel circuit chip. So every time you see that Intel on your computer, Robert Noyce went as a student to Grinnell, apparently dropped out and then came back again, but left them some stock. So they're doing okay. I then went on to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where I did my degrees, and then I worked both at UMass and at Mount Holyoke. But one of the things that I tried to do is to also support HBCUs. So my son attended Clark Atlanta University. I encouraged him, even though he could have had a free ride at UMass, where his father and I worked, I encouraged him to step out and go to an HBCU. And so he chose Clark Atlanta. But since then, I have worked as deputy provost at Fisk. I was tenured at the University of Florida. and took 2 years off to work under Carolyn Reed Wallace, who was the first Black woman president at Fisk, and who also was my teacher at Grinnell College. She was the first Black faculty hired in a tenure track position in the early 70s. And then I went from Fisk and to Bennett College in North Carolina, and I founded the Africana Women's Studies program there and worked while Janetta Cole was president there. And then my time at Shaw. But before I got to Shaw, when I was at the Ford Foundation from 2005 to 2007, one of the things I tried to do was to work to support HBCUs getting more funding from the Ford Foundation. So I've had like a nice hand in working both across, in predominantly white institutions, but also in historically Black colleges and universities. And I think there is a sea change. I mean, I think that what the pandemic did was to force people to look at different learning styles, how to deliver information and content in different kinds of ways. And that used to be the domain of people who did homeschooling, and there wasn't a lot of resources. Now there are many more resources available. I think colleges and just traditional colleges and universities are having to reinvent themselves. I think the challenges for HBCUs is that they were behind the curve before COVID hit in terms of developing their infrastructure. Most of them don't have the technological services and platforms that many of the historically white institutions have, at least not at the same level. Many of them don't have the resources to manage their facilities so that they're staying up to the state of art in many ways. And so there's a big lag in there. And I've always said one of my visions is that if every Black pro football and basketball player gave $1 million a year, just $1 million a year, into a generic fund, not for scholarships, because there's enough money for scholarships for Black students. But if you're not paying your faculty, if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have deferred maintenance, if you're not able to keep your equipment up, then giving students scholarships to institutions that don't have those things is not going to do well. If every pro football player, every NBA star gave $1 million into a fund, and it's a tax write-off, that money could begin to support the infrastructure of HBCUs. So that's a dream that I have.
It's a great dream. It's a great vision.
Kudos to what
Where do you see
background. Oh my goodness. Beautiful.
What's the other end of this tunnel that we're in now, Dr. Irma? What do you see as options that will be available to people that maybe were not available before in the arena of learning and education and access, empowerment, all those things that go with that?
And or consequences.
Right. I think the academy is changing. It's having, first of all, most of them were not prepared for a crisis. Okay, so many administrators at institutions across the spectrum, predominantly white, historically Black, have never actually had to manage in a crisis situation. And they simply weren't prepared. They don't have the resources. What I'm hearing from my coaching clients who work in higher education is that there's a tremendous amount of pressure on them. And at the same time, students aren't able to cope. Many of them are not engaging in the way they would have if they were face to face. They're also shifting who gets to be tenured. They're not hiring new people, so they're asking people who are already there to do more. And so there's a whole range of things. I mean, I think we're going to see multi-tiered kind of teaching categories. You're going to have people who are tenured, who teach and do research. You're going to have people who just teach. You're going to have people who just teach online, which is already there, but I think it's going to expand because and someone just said, well, this institution is now going to become permanently hybrid. It's going to have some places where people get to go face to face on campus and some that are hybrid. The question is, who gets to have access to the real deal up close and personal, and who's going to be relegated to only having their college experience online? And usually the difference is determined by resources. Who has the money? to pay for like room and board, because what most people don't understand is that higher education is not funded by tuition, because many people discount their tuition for athletes, for scholarships. And so it's not real money that's coming in. Where they make their money is on student fees and on dormitory, residence halls. Those are the things that drive. Now they've got all these residence halls that are standing empty primarily, right? And they're not, but they still have to pay the bonds that they use to make the, to build them, or they're still paying on the mortgage. There are very few institutions that own their dormitories outright. And so they're still having to manage that money. And so where's that going to come from? Are the students who get to live on campus and go in person are going to pay a higher tuition than those who do hybrid, courses? There's going to be a whole, what kind of teachers? Are the teachers going to be more adjunct faculty as opposed to giving people permanent positions? And right now, the majority of people who get stuck in adjunct positions, meaning that they teach multiple courses, they don't have any benefits, and they have no guarantee of permanency, are largely people of color.
Wow.
We both Yusef?
It's not a pretty picture. It's not a pretty picture.
That's all we could say was wow.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in the predominantly white institutions, one of the challenges that we've faced for decades at the University of Minnesota is that 80% of the faculty of color are foreign-born Asian faculty. And the African-American faculty are appointed with joint appointments. They're in the geography and the history department, or in their music and the math department, and they're serving two masters, which, as you know, is impossible because it's what you do within that department in terms of performance, teaching, publishing, etc., that allows for your advancement. And it's not a very healthy environment for African-American faculty members.
And even those in other departments. When I was at the University of Florida, I was tenured in 1999. I was the first Black and person of color ever to be tenured in anthropology in 1999.
Wow. I believe it.
Yeah. Another wow, Vicky.
And at that point, in the entire College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Florida, which is the flagship in Gainesville, the home of the Gators, that is the largest college. There were only 3 Black associate professors, 3. That's in the entire College of Arts and Sciences. And there were only 3 full Black professors. And from what I can see of the stats, I left and I resigned from my tenured position in 2006, and that's a whole nother story. But from what I can tell, the numbers actually haven't increased that much.
When I enrolled in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, there was 1 Black, me, 1 Negro, and 1 colored student. And that was the totality. 56,000 okay, 56,000 students on campus.
And I think what's happening too is that we are continuing to produce PhDs. And the whole purpose of a PhD was to really prepare students to go into this pipeline of faculty. Well, people are not hiring. As people retire or as they die, they're not replacing the positions. And so now we've got this whole cadre of very sort of talented people who were really sort of the curriculum is really designed to do research and then go into a teaching position. We have to figure out how to teach them to do other kinds of things, because the academy is actually shrinking. It's not going to get bigger. It's actually going to shrink to a large extent.
Mm-hmm.
Let me pivot a little bit. Yusef and I were talking before the show today about a couple of issues, and one that we wanted to bring up was what's happening with the no-knock legislation or no-knock policy around the country. Yusef, what was on your mind?
Well, many state legislatures are now looking at it. There are only 4 states who have banned no-knock warrants. And the Washington Post, after Breonna Taylor was killed, did a year-long investigation looking at no-knocks. Tens of thousands of them have been implemented. They were supposed to be used in rare cases. Now we have electronic no-knock warrants because the judges have software, and instead of meeting face-to-face with the police officer who is requesting them, they simply press a button and approve it.
Ooh.
which makes the system more efficient, but may strip some of the efficacy from the process, because the police are required to, they have the burden of proof that a no-knock warrant is necessary because of the potential for kidnapping or a loss of life or some severe danger. And there have been 22 Black people, 22 people killed as a result of no-knock warrants since 2015. The most recent that gained national publicity was Amir Locke in Minneapolis, and we have a Black state attorney general who had the difficulty of trying to raise the burden of proof such that he could charge the officer. And all a police officer has to say is, I feared for my life. This young man was sleeping on a couch under a blanket. He had a concealed carry permit. The officers went in. He was a sound sleeper, so he was asleep on the couch with a blanket over his head, and they were kicking the couch to wake him up, and he stirred, and he came out from under the blanket, and he had his gun in his hand, and he had his finger along the barrel, not on the trigger, and they shot him immediately and killed him. Okay, perfectly innocent. And the officer was acquitted, no charges whatsoever. We do believe that there will be a civil trial, and that the city of Minneapolis is going to have to settle with the family of Amir Locke. But they're using them mostly for drug cases. They're finding very few drugs. There's very little accountability. And again, the burden of proof is on the people. You know, they arrested Breonna Taylor's boyfriend because they kicked the door down. He got his gun and thought they were being jacked or raided and started firing back. And the only charges were brought against a police officer in the parking lot who was firing shots into an adjacent apartment, thinking that was the one the police were breaking into. And he was charged with unlawful discharge of his weapon, something stupid.
Reckless endangerment or something like that.
Yeah.
And he was acquitted of that too, right?
Yeah.
He didn't even get convicted for that.
So this no-knock business is absolutely terrible. Frequently, they go to the wrong address or they get bum information from a snitch. There's a movie that Tom Selleck is in that part of the title is Innocence, because they were going to 696 and instead went to 969, and he had a hairdryer, and they shot him and arrested him and planted a gun, and he went to prison. And you know, it was a good movie, but very depressing subject. And this business of no-knock warrants is coming out of the closet, and is really going to have to be dealt with seriously.
And it's no different than, you know, there used to be search and seizure, you know, and we sort of got rid of that, but they all come out of the same mindset, which is that these are based on speculative, you know, very little concrete information. And you're relying upon the judgment of people who've already proven themselves to harbor implicit bias.
And to be
dishonest. And the way that they're trained to act first and think about it later, right? And so there's a real problem, you know, in this.
Because I think you would agree with me when Yusef was describing Amir, but to think of Fred Hampton when they just stood across the street and shot in, and he was sound asleep.
Yeah.
This is no different than what was happening under apartheid. When I went to the Mandela House in Soweto, one of the things they show you are the bullet holes from the police being outside in the street shooting in. And the building, the house was very small. They had a small room for the kids, for the children, the girls, and a small bedroom for them. And they show you this place in the what you would call the sort of living room, that there's this line, and he says, this is the brick wall that Winnie had built that she and her children would hide behind when the police started shooting. They had to build a brick wall inside the living room as a protection from the shots. And you can see bullet holes on the outside, bullet holes on the walls on the inside of where, you know, and the same thing in the church where the children gathered. You see the bullet holes in the stained glass. They've kept the panels coming into the building, and then they show you the same way in which the police, once they came in, they were shooting outside to shoot people as they left. And these were the children.
And why do the police get to have that much discretion, and why are they so much more believable than everyone else? I sat in on a case about a month ago in my hometown, just a little citation case, and the magistrate judge actually sat there and said, well, I'm going to believe everything that the police officer says. I'm like, really? Then why are the rest of us here? Because if you're going to believe everything that he says, there's no point for no defendant to even come to court or anything, because you've already made up your mind. Same thing with these warrants. They believe everything that the police officer says. And now that they're doing electronically, you can't even look at their face to see whether or not they're telling the truth and assess their credibility. It's unbelievable.
And if we didn't have the video, it would have been the same thing with Derek Chauvin.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't think it would have changed that much.
The police department in Minneapolis issued a statement that said that Derek Chauvin died from pre-existing medical conditions.
Not Derek, but
George Floyd died.
George Floyd, yeah.
And after 9 million views on Facebook, they issued a release that said, well, we have to begin an investigation because he may have died as a result of inappropriate actions.
Just imagine.
Think?
They were trying to cover it up from Jump Street. And
you know what, Al? I think Roy Lewis had such a great point. That young 17-year-old, she's probably 19 now, she needs to be honored in some way. Because no matter what has happened, she made the difference. And I don't think she thought two things about it. I'm going to film this. I don't even think she didn't show too much fear.
I think she was conscious that something was going on, but we also have to look at, even if you honor her, the trauma that she has had to undergo of having to film that, because she was also with a younger relative.
9 years old.
The younger relative watching, and the trauma. I mean, I listened to part of her speech, her testimony, and we talk about all this, like, we need better trained police, and I do some of that training of people, and I've had to stop and say, when I do this training, no one ever asks, what is the cost of that? The psychic and emotional and traumatic cost to me as the presenter, knowing that I'm presenting to an audience that, one, can take the language that I give them, walk out that door and shoot me, my son, or anyone else, and then simply say, well, I was just trained by Dr. Irma on, implicit bias, so I'm cool, right? In other words, I'm justified. We have to think about all this call for people being trained and stuff. Are we simply giving them tools to then further oppress us, but now they have the language, the nomenclature to be able to say, well, I understand this and I understand that, so therefore I couldn't have been biased, when I killed that person? I mean, and then also, what does it do to the people doing that training to look at those faces and no, they don't believe what you're saying, but they're there because they want to be able to put that little check mark right on whatever their resume, and for the department to say, well, we sent them through training. And this is no different from all the training of sexual harassment and domestic violence with police. It hasn't reduced the numbers.
Nope.
It hasn't reduced the numbers. And some of the domestic violence is actually perpetrated by the police on their own families and girlfriends.
Well, look what they did during the civil uprisings and the peaceful protests. They treated the protesters just like they treated the agitators and the anarchists, shooting rubber bullets indiscriminately. Minneapolis police were recorded on police radio saying, let's go out and get some more protesters, and that's in effect what they were doing.
We like to believe that because people work in these state agencies, that somehow they're able to disconnect and leave their culture at the door. That's not how culture works. It's not a coat that you can put on and put off and then not be. It infuses a lot of what we understand and learn about culture as part of our tacit memory, which means that it's not at the top of our mind. It's just so deeply embedded, and it's almost like an automatic reflex. It's a cultural reflex. And so we don't know what's in people's heads because most people are totally unaware that they've been socialized and enculturated. They just don't think about it in that way.
And theirs is a warrior culture. Let's face it.
Vicki, let me ask you, do you sense that policing is different in Washington, D.C., as far as our community is concerned, than it might be in Minneapolis or St. Paul or Irma? What's your experience having lived in Chicago and in cities that have larger Black populations and having lived here in Minnesota as well? I question, if you have a Black agency, Black-led and Black-populated law enforcement agency, does that translate to more fair, more just, or just more people beating you up?
The heads
there
are
was
going.
a chief in there in DC that, and I'll never forget it. I don't want to say Fullwood, but I think it was Fullwood. He said, "We got the biggest and the baddest gang in the city."
And that's
how Mayor Daley of Chicago treated the police department. It was his own personal mafia. And so we knew that we were never going to be safe. To answer your question, Al, people inhabit systems. Systems can operate on their own. And it doesn't matter what the face of the person leading the system is. If the system isn't changed, it doesn't matter what they look like. If all white people disappeared tomorrow, we'd still have racism because it's embedded in the system. So having Black people lead it, or having a person of color lead it, or having a woman lead it does not necessarily change the system unless they're invested in that kind of fundamental change. All we're doing is like chess pieces. We're just changing the players. We use the knights and they're Black, so you can have Black policemen. But once they get into that culture is a culture of blue. So it doesn't matter what your skin color is. If you're trying to be part of that culture, you're going to go along with the program. You just drink the Kool-Aid.
So that leads me back to the original question, and I'll close on this, ask you all to comment. So what about higher education? The mission of higher education is what? And for whom? And how do we both interact with it, use it, and how do we, as I think Greg Carr would say, jailbreak this process where we really don't matter as long as we subscribe to and play through the charts that have been written by the institution, which perpetuate the institution, that being white supremacist thought. What do we do about that, Doctor? And Yusef and Vicki and Brenda?
Well, I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, Al. I taught at Antioch University in the Black community. I taught in the prisons, and I don't mind saying I had a captive audience. And some of the most challenging and rewarding teaching that I've done has been in the prisons. For 40 years, I was a volunteer in the federal prison. The primary purpose of higher education is career preparation. It's a business model. You get the degree and then you qualify to apply for certain jobs or licenses. And I always felt, the slaves used to say, capture knowledge, fly to freedom. Okay. And I think that was the purpose for the establishment of the HBCUs, because Black people were unable to enter and to participate in a wholesome fashion in the PWIs, primarily white institutions. And they were created for the furtherance and for the development of our communities. Because up until 30 years ago, most of the Black professionals in this country, a majority, came out of HBCUs. They didn't come out
university.
of the Ivy League or the state colleges or the community colleges. Today, we have more young people going into the correctional system than we have going into post-secondary education.
Right.
And that is an indictment against the future of our community, because lots of young people who don't have the resources are going into community college, and they're taking hairdressing, they're taking apprenticeship, they're taking construction, they're taking jobs where they can earn a lot of money in a very short period and provide for their family. And you can't hold that against people. A lot of young families have young children, and they need to be able to support them. The junior colleges or the community colleges are one path. Apprenticeship and the building and construction trades is another. But we've got to look at higher education as the future development of our own communities.
I think that we need a radical change. What higher education is today, and I agree with you, Yusef, that today it is oriented towards getting a job and preparing, but that was not its original function. The function of a liberal arts education was to expose people to various kinds of learnings and knowledge and create critical thinkers and learning. And we've lost sight of that. And I think we've now created it so that it is supposed to be an automatic funnel into some kind of job market. And as such, we've lost sight of the critical thinking, the critical writing, really pushing students to learn and explore ideas and stuff. So I have been an administrator all the way to the top. I've never taken a course in leadership because that's not how you became a leader back in the day. You did it, but I had exposure. I had writing skills. I knew how to think critically. I knew how to analyze. Those were skill sets that you learned, and we've lost sight of that. So I think that there has to be a radical change in what higher education stands for, particularly as we move into the 22nd century. And we need to stop putting so much emphasis on the sciences, because the sciences, if they're not connected to the social sciences and the arts, it disconnects the thinking from the humanity.
The most important, the skills you mentioned, Irma, are transferable skills.
And absolutely, yeah. And so
I think the basis of all is literacy.
Yeah, I learned how to type 90 words a minute in the 9th grade. And it's
I was trained to be a legal secretary, so I know how to type and take shorthand, and those skills served me well.
It's the most transferable skill I ever had, and everywhere I went, it got me promoted immediately. Okay?
Vicki, let me close with you. What are your thoughts?
When I got off the program with you this morning, and it's something I've been thinking about for a while now too. I've only been back to Penn State to visit 3 times since I graduated in 88. That was in 89, 2016, and then recently in 2022. And so my question is, and my Penn Staters, they get a little upset with me when I say it, but at what point are we going to advocate for our kids to go to HBCUs as opposed to PWIs, where we know that it's going to be a miserable experience for them? And when I went back those last 2 times, it just hurt my heart to hear that those kids, those babies, were still going through the same things that we were going through in the 80s. And so, I'm glad we're having the conversation. And, I met people at Penn State that are my friends to this day, but I don't know. I don't know if I'd want to.
But HBCUs have their own internal culture.
I know they do.
It has its issues. Okay, it's not.
I know perfect. They do. We talked about that this morning too. Okay. So, but
Vicki, I had to invite CORE up on the campus of Redlands, and then Bill Whitcomb from the Department of Justice came in to my daughter's high school when the skinheads were soliciting memberships. So. And in 2003 with CORE, they went up on campus and they were just shocked. And I'm like Dr. Irma now. I don't know if the situations on either side have changed that much. If not, in some ways, they've gotten worse.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we're out of time right now. This has been a great conversation. Thank you all, Dr. Irma McLaren, Brenda Lyle Gray, Ndugu Yusef Mgeni, and Vicki Wright-Smith. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Nice meeting you, Vicki. Good luck.
Nice meeting all of you. I was fascinated by all of you.
It was great.
And that's by you, dear. Thank you.
And Dr. Irma, thank you so much for the master class every Thursday.
Have a good one.
Show enough. Bye.